Hello, Assalamualaikum, and good morning to everyone here. Let me introduce myself. My name is Nur Najwa, and I am the moderator for today's webinar session. So before we start the session, let me know, where do you guys come from? From which company, from which organization, or perhaps from which universities? You can type in the chat box, because I know that some of you guys from university students, lecturers, architects, timber industry. See, Wildlife from Technology Malaysia. We have here GBC Malaysia, Maybank. Oh, okay. We also have here, Maybank as well. Okay. Marketing Sdn Bhd JT UTM student, Dr. Su from UPM, UMS, Architect, David, Maran Timber, Accord Furniture. Okay, nice. Okay. Thank you everyone for your response. So now let's start our session. First of all, welcome to the Malaysian Timber Council Timber Talk Series 2022. I would like to thank everyone for taking your time to join our session today, and I hope that everyone is doing great today. And for your information, this is our second webinar session for this year. Our first session was held in January, and you may watch the recording of the webinar session on the Malaysian Timber Council YouTube channel. Do check out our YouTube channel and share the video with your friends so that they will also gain some knowledge from this webinar. Also, do follow Malaysian Timber Council social media such as Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter to see our activities lined up, as well as getting the latest information related to the timber industry. So before we start our session, I would like to invite MTC Strategic Planning and Corporate Communication Director, Ms. Lauli Har, to deliver welcome remarks on behalf of MTC CEO. Ms. Lihar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Najwa, for the introduction. Good morning and a very warm welcome to all the attendees for joining us today amidst your busy schedules. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the MTC Timber Talk 2022 webinar series, organized with the intention to generate interest and explore the use of timbers in the built environment. Through the MTC Timber Talk series, we have featured many renowned architects to share their insights and experiences in dealing with timber in their architectural and design projects. This is one of the many MTC's efforts to educate and provide informative insights into the best design practices, latest innovations, and knowledge sharing of interesting case studies from the leading experts in timber design, specification, and construction. Today, we are very honored to have with us architect Serina Hijjas, a principal director of Hijjas Kasturi Associates. She is one of the most dynamic women personalities on Malaysia's sustainability front. Architect Serina is a prominent architect and has extensive experience in designing a plethora of buildings and is known for her energy efficient and sustainable design of building landscape architecture. On behalf of MTC, I would like to record my gratitude to Architect Serina for agreeing to be our speaker today. I was informed that her presentation titled Net Zero and Growing Our Cities will touch on the importance of climate-resilient architecture, designs, and bring awareness on how to reduce the current carbon trajectory with net zero carbon in mind. MTC will always support the development of green growth and circular policies in the industry. This could be seen in MTC's Green Initiative program, where we assist the timber industry by providing incentives for the purchase of air pollution control equipment and solar photovoltaic system to comply with reducing air pollution and utilizing renewable energy. Timber continues to be the material of choice in the making of high-performance, environmentally sensitive architecture. It is also known as a renewable and more sustainable building material option that can store carbon to reduce the effects of global warming. However, the procurement of timber requires a concerted effort and of building professionals and suppliers in order to achieve a system that allows for the ease of using this material to its fullest potential. This webinar is therefore part of an effort to spark more interest among local users on the benefits of timber, as well as to encourage the specification of using more timber in their projects. I hope you will enjoy and gain valuable insights from today's webinar session and continue to support and join our future series of Timber Talk, which we have prepared throughout this year. I therefore thank all of you once again for joining our session today. Your participation shows your continued strong support for all our programs. Let me also take this opportunity to wish our Muslim attendees a blessed month of Ramadan, and may this holy month bring you an abundance of blessings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Lauliha, for the welcoming remarks. Now we shall proceed with our next agenda. So before we start the session, I would like to cover a few housekeeping rules. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions by typing your questions into the Q&A box on your screen. And you may also post your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will later address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. So our topic today is Net Zero and Growing Our Cities by architect Serina Hijjas. Architect Serina has more than 20 years of experience in architectural planning and design. In 2020, her firm designed Malaysian Pavilion for Expo 2020 Dubai. Apart from that, her notable projects include Telekom Malaysia headquarter buildings, Security Commission headquarters, Sasana Kijang, Bank Negara Malaysia, Celcom Tower, Kuala Lumpur Shell headquarters, Putrajaya Convention Centre and Malaysian Pavilion Expo Milano 2015. Serina also won the Asian Energy Efficiency Award and was nominated for the Aga Khan Award. Hello, okay. She is also a founding member of the Green Building Index. So without further ado, I would like to invite our speaker today, architect Serina Hijjas. Over to you, Serina.
Thank you very much and good morning. Selamat berpuasa. Today I also understand it's Good Friday, so that's why the streets are pretty empty and it was pretty easy to get in today to work for the first time. It's good to see a semi-normal back to work as we are practicing this next stage. So just go back one, sorry. I will just close my window here. Can't see too much. Yeah, thank you very much. When I was approached to give a talk for the Malaysian Timber Council, I first of all would like to thank the Malaysian Timber Council for their great support for the Dubai Expo as well, which just finished and closed its door on the 1st of April after running for about 6 months. And the pavilion itself had about 1.2 million visitors in just that 6 months. So it's equivalent to running for about 5 months. And the timber building stood the test of time. I really wanted to touch a little bit about net zero and the direction we're going in the next 10 years and touch on this idea of growing cities. Growing cities came out from all the pavilions that built timber structures at Expo, getting together and talking about how we can move forward in terms of the population that's growing and resources that is reducing. So I guess I'd like to just touch a little bit about first generation green buildings. When I was speaking to MTC, they said, all right, just not just the projects on timber, but perhaps just give an overview of some of the projects that you've been doing. I started working when I was working in Malaysia here. I started all my works with the idea that energy efficiency was to be the call of the day. And at that time, let's say, we must say more than 20 years ago, we were talking about energy efficiency, water, and waste. And this is what we call, I would like to call the first generation of green buildings. We're really concerned about these elements. So Celcom Tower is not a timber building, but perhaps what I wanted to allude is about the ideas of sustainability and how we're moving and how we're arriving to this concept of adopting timber, not only for our finishes, furniture, walls, doors, but really to consider it as a building structure, so having a structural element. In Celcom Tower, it's a new vertical work office. As you can see from the form of the building, it was really inspired by, at the time, cellular phones that were sort of very bulbous in shape. And so it was inspired by that because we were representing a telco, but the telco's vision, Celcom's vision, was to provide an office building that was basically was free desk working. That means hot desking. And as you know, at the time, the runner, one of the fastest runner, Usain Bolt, was basically also promoting Celcom, and Celcom would always call this is Celcom territory, in the idea that, you know, connection networks were provided within this territory of area by Celcom. So the building is a very interesting building, and I guess for most people, they will say, well, it's a glass building and it must be incredibly hot. How can it be sustainable? How can it be green? Well, this building basically performs at about 47% less energy than most buildings in Kuala Lumpur. So that's almost hitting a 50%. And we say 50% and more is what we call advancing net zero. As you see inside the space, there's of course use of some of the timber, but what's exciting about the space was this new work environment that was being created for Celcom. People had hot desking, they would be able to come into the offices, they did not have a stationary table, they had breakout spaces. It was really addressing connection and working when and wherever, which was essentially paperless. So in terms of the working environment, it was also ahead of its time. And I must say that even during the pandemic, it stood them well working in this kind of environment of hot desking, because then working from home became very, very easy for them. So this is just a view of KL Central, where the building is under construction. And I wanted to point out here that for buildings itself, there is a performance, apart from, you know, the architecture, the concept, and everything else. There is a need to address the thermal performance of these buildings. So in this building, it's below the Malaysian standard of 50 kilowatts meter square per year, and it's about 48.7. And that's because quite cleverly behind the glass building is also spandrels, and this building has a triple glazing on the building itself. So getting to a 121, it's a bit like saying you're using a Prius. This is basically the Prius, Toyota Prius of office buildings, because it's energy efficient in the way it is functioning. So I think if I give you that analogy, then you probably understand, because nowadays, if you wanted to hire a car and they actually tell you the petrol consumption and they tell you all this information. So buildings now are also heading that way. And why is it that important? Because we really have to get beyond a 50% reduction in everything that we're doing from this point on. As you can see, not all of the building is actually glazing. It appears like it's glazing. And it's a very clever building in that sense, because it has hybrid core, I call it, because the core is not in the center. It's moved out to the side. The toilets are naturally ventilated, as you can see from here, so that you get natural ventilation inside it. And the offices that are basically facing more or less more north and south, and the east and the west suns are basically where you get more solid facades. So building in a tropical environment is very, very different than building in a northern hemisphere environment. When we build in the tropics, we have to be really considering in terms of the rain, the heat, and the sun path. And so we generally say north-south orientation is basically the best for any of the buildings, whether it's going to be built in timber or not. Passive design in terms of orientation is still very, very important. So you can see here, you know, traditionally, all of you are probably working in normal offices where the core is in the center. But the core actually moves out to the side. And what we've been able to create is staircase links inside the offices. So it becomes a lot more connected. That's what we meant about giving physical connection between floors. And so you have every 3 floors connections between floors and meeting pods that are in these common areas inside the space. So the space inside becomes more of a community space. So every 3 floors, there are these community spaces within the office building, which is really quite different. There is a work-play concept in the sense that it's not just, you know, the lines of offices that you kind of see, and you get these pods, as you can see in the kind of breakout spaces that you have here. So yeah, it's I think we're very proud of it, but just to mention that even Telekom Malaysia, which was designed by us, was already achieving 25 years ago a 45% energy reduction at about 103 kilowatts per meter square per year, also due to passive louvers and things like that. But the sky gardens are on the east and west sides, and so that actually gives a thermal barrier to the building itself. One of our other up-and-coming projects that you probably don't see, we don't have our website up just yet, and so most people probably think that, you know, there's not much projects that are happening at Hijjas, but there is. This is FINA's Film Studio Archives, which is coming up now. It'll be starting construction very soon after quite a long period of gestation during the pandemic and everything else. And it's also going to be a certified green building. So its concept is basically film and film reels and digitization. So you can see on the building facade, this kind of language of digitization. This film, FINAS will also host the archives for the film in Malaysia, as well as studios for filming and auditorium for production. So it's pretty exciting. We're very excited that it's going to be starting soon. It's been a long time in terms of gestation and development of concept and in terms of design. And it will have all these kind of event spaces, public spaces, and business opportunity spaces. So yeah, it looks taller than it seems. It's only about 18 stories here. But I think where we're going now, and you'll start to see what I'm talking about, as we're going to this, what I call the second generation of green buildings, we are basically more concerned now about targeting net zero and low carbon. So this design that we did, I call it the Canopy Urban Village. It's a look at giving affordable housing and densification a different approach. I think that most of you who have seen the developments around the Middle Ring Road in Kuala Lumpur or in Penang and major cities know that urbanization, and we're supposed to hit a target of 7 billion in the next coming years, not Malaysia alone, but globally. And that means that a lot of people are moving into the city centers, and we are responding by building taller and more dense to accommodate people. So we might have started, and this was a study we did for Penang, where, you know, in the Park Butterworth, there was only about 4 blocks and 78 units per acre was the density. And it was only rising about 14 stories. I'd like to say that that was probably much more livable than where we are going now, whilst we might be giving more facilities to the affordable. It's my own belief that going higher is not the best for affordable housing. But that's just my own opinion. If we can get it a lot tighter and a lot more grounded to the ground, it's much better for the people that are living inside the space. Then in Penang, they've moved up to about 96 units per acre at 34 stories. And I've got to say that this is not symptomatic of just Penang. This is symptomatic of all urban cities that are looking to basically house more people and go higher. In Prima, for example, it's up at 140 units, 48 units per acre at 32 stories. The rise is higher than that. It's actually rising to 173. And then, you see it rises to 190 to 223, and the latest is at about 244 units per acre at 42 stories. And so we studied 29 public schemes, 340, we know there's about 340 developments, but we just looked at some of these public schemes and looked at the number of population. And it's estimated that Penang also will have this growth in the next five to 10 years of up to 500,000. And that's probably why Penang State is looking at how to grow the city and develop the Penang South Islands. These were some of the studies that we did, and some of the inspirations that we have here, just showing, for example, the Moshti Sakti habitat in 1967, already looking at prefabrication housing for mass housing, already stacking up. But look at the design that he had. It's basically creating a kind of mountain, which would not work for the Malaysian climate. In the Malaysian climate, we actually have to consider shading our buildings. We actually have to consider what is our tropical response to our climate and our sustainability. So what we had created was inverted that design form and give a density of about 10, 12, or 14 stories, create a kind of big umbrella canopy roof, and on top of that roof have urban farming and solar panels. And as you can see, the sides of the buildings are basically shading and providing a 15 to 25 degrees self-shading from the direct sun, and creating some public shaded streets and marketplace and courtyards. As you know, it's very much in our culture to have pasar malam and markets. And so creating this sort of huge canopy and spaces for public was also important. And you can see that we, to make it feel not cold for housing, we were using timber as in the idea of shading, as well as providing warmth to the housing, people living in the houses. So it's very much responding to creating a much more livable housing for affordable people. And that at any point you can still look out at the trees around you and not look down to the trees, which I think in terms of health and well-being is a lot more integrated in the idea there. So this was a study that we did, which was a competition in Penang, but essentially we wanted to see how can we improve lives and what is it that we improve lives. And I think that one thing that is very, very certain is that timber and the warmth of timber definitely creates a much better sense of health and well-being for people. And these were just some of the studies of the sustainable elements that we were doing: water harvesting, energy efficiency, and bringing daylight inside the space and allowing planting and putting urban planting on top. This is another project that we have, Uni 10 Open Lab. It's under construction at the moment. It's also a green building. And you can see that we put louvers on the outside of the building as a form of shading. Some of the research and study that we had done from the previous housing has come into this development of this research center and university campus in Uni 10. It's called Open Lab for TNB. and it's due to be completed at the end of this year. But the interesting component about this, right in the center of this building, so the concept is creating a bit more energy inside the space. So instead of creating a research center that was just going straight up, instead of creating the pyramid, as we mentioned before, that once we do this, there's a lot more heat gain in terms of the building. But if we actually rotate that and put it that we have a much bigger roof and then give the 15-degree slope inside for the spaces, we basically perform much better inside for as far as passive orientation is for the building. So this was the geometry and concept. But what's exciting to us is creating this wooded garden of trees inside in the courtyard itself. So we are embracing the nature inside the space, which is integral to the building in terms of shading and in terms of the common areas places. So this is our way of addressing that and bringing the greenery into the space itself and creating a far greener campus inside the space. So we're pretty excited about that. This is the shading into the building. So it's really, really important. Responding to shade and responding to rain is probably two of the biggest things that we need to respond in the tropical environment. So this is the building under construction, very thin columns going up, supporting the Unit 10 building on top. The research center is actually below here, underneath this space. So these are actually workshops underneath here. And they were doing their first tree planting, which TNB is also investing back to actually plant trees as part of their campaign. The next generation and the generation for us now is advancing net zero. And the reason for advancing net zero and low carbon is that climate resilience is very, very important. We are already suffering climate change. And I just wanted to show you what I meant by suffering climate change. This is essentially the Earth looking at the North Pole. And when they spoke about the hole, the ozone hole layer in there. In the year 2000, this was the size of the ozone layer, the hole that was created by CFCs and fluorocarbons. So in 1987, they banned CFCs and fluorocarbons, and that affected basically our air conditioning and fridges were using previously fluorocarbons and CFCs. But you can see that even 23 years later, this was the size of it. And it's taken more than almost 30 years for the size to be reduced to that. And what this means is that whatever actions that we are taking now will only take into effect another 15 to 20 years. So the effects of climate change, even if we go to net zero right now, today, we will still feel the effects of it for another 10 to 15 years due to all the rest that we had created before then. So it's really important when we talk about 2030 and 2050, the government having targets. My own belief is we really should be advancing net zero right now and meeting a target by 2030 and not 2050. So I wanted to give you an understanding a little bit about global CO2 emissions. It's very abstract, even for me, what is carbon emissions? But I wanted to tell you about construction. In the construction sector, when we build buildings, highways, hospitals, towers, everything else in terms of structures, whether it's for roads, cars, or buildings and houses or people. In the construction industry, 10% is what we call embodied energy or embodied carbon, shall I say. Embodied carbon means the material, the manufacturing, the transportation, the installation, the construction of materials takes up about 10% of the world's embodied carbon use. And we'll come back to this a little bit because you'll see the example of embodied carbon in the Malaysian pavilion and why Malaysia was the first to go for net zero at Expo 2021, sorry. The construction takes up in terms of operational carbon, that means how much energy we use in terms of lighting, cooling our houses and spaces, takes up another 28%. So it's almost more than double that, more than 200% is in the operational. That's why there's been a very big emphasis in reducing and becoming more energy efficient and in terms of renewable energy. But the embodied carbon is where we are concerned is the next move. So we call it from moving from EE to RE, from energy efficiency to renewable energy, is now becoming the norm. DBKL basically now says that for all major buildings, new buildings in the city, the rooftops should have basically solar PV as one of the requirements when they submit in. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too. So operational carbon we spoke is 28%. So if we can make our buildings more energy efficient and provide renewable energy, so much the better. But I want to go back into the embodied, and I was really fascinated by the video that Malaysian Timber Council is basically putting up. We are still building mostly in concrete, metal and glass. So the global raw material extraction and production of construction materials such as metals, concrete, causes a wide range of environmental impacts. And out of that, basically, if we say 2/3 is in operational and 1/3 of the energy, the global energy, or global carbon, sorry, is in embodied carbon. Out of this embodied carbon, 60% is in the structural materials that builds the materials, and 40% is other materials being carpet, in the interior fit out of the spaces, the M&E equipment, but 60% makes up the structure of the building and how we build. So green buildings to reduce are really designed to eliminate and reduce the negative impacts of the environment by using less water, energy, and natural resources. But now the next generation should have a more positive impact on the environment and be more nature-based solutions. We're talking about nature-based solutions and biodiversity, and lowering embodied energy to become more carbon neutral to address the climate resilience. So everyone has been talking about the 1.5 degree temperature change. And this is what we call a heat vulnerability index map. So this is Penang. If you did a satellite heat mapping of Penang, which Think City did for Penang, Ipoh, Johor Bahru, which you can see online by Think City. It shows that wherever we have all the housing and developments, where the high density of buildings are, where the low residentials are, where there's no green pockets inside, that's the heat vulnerability, showing you the heat mapping in those locations, the urban heat island effects that are happening there. Where it's naturally green, unfortunately for Penang, still most of it is green, that you can see is actually much cooler. And in fact, the measurement down in Bayan Lepas, temperature has hit 1.5 degrees mean temperature changes in Penang already, a shift since 1951 measurements to 2018. So once you see a picture of a mapping, and you all know that red is hot and green and blue is cooler, shall we say, then you naturally can understand that. And I think when they do a heat mapping, this is not, of course, Penang, just to correct that. This is a much higher density city. We say at the Malaysian Green Building Council, cooler buildings, cooler cities. So if we can get our buildings to be cooler, if we can provide more greenery, urban greenery, we basically can reduce the amount of heat island. And funny enough, for Penang, they did a poll and they found out that it was not rain that affected most people, but heat that affected. Heat strokes and heat was one of the big items. And that's probably also because it's partially an island. And therefore the humidity levels are slightly higher. So what does it got to do with an architect? I guess it's an area that we've been very interested in, and we continue to do some research in every building that we do. So we talked about concrete, metal, and glass. Now we're talking more about including wood. Materials we use for building, we need now to consider embodied and operational energy and whole life cycle of materials. In other words, not putting all our materials to waste after. So the whole life cycle is really considering the wood. And for the 2 Malaysian pavilions that we were very fortunate to work on, wood was our choice of primary material to use. Both in terms of structure, but combining it with steel because to make it more lightweight and sturdy. So there was a hybrid in how we actually looked at that. So when we consider reducing embodied carbon impacts to the building and structural materials, what timber can do is we have to consider basically selecting lower embodied carbon, which timber has. Leaner design. So we are seeing that concrete is starting to mix recycle elements into concrete for construction. We're also seeing that people are regenerative, and when they are taking down buildings, using those concrete materials and crushing them and reusing them, designing out waste and reusing materials. So this is what we mean by looking at the whole life cycle. And at the World Green Building, we basically have some definitions on what is net zero operational and embodied carbon, and what we need to look at preventing, reducing, optimizing, and planning and offsetting where we can't help it. But I don't know if any of you have actually tried doing the ecological footprint by WWF. WWF has this thing called How Big is Your Environmental Footprint? I took the test, and even with just one travel to Dubai, I had exceeded the ecological footprint. The ecological footprint is how much the earth can sustain you currently with what it has. So, and the capacity that we are using at the moment is more than 2.3 times the amount of the capacity of the earth. And we need to get down to 0 in order to balance and neutralize that. So I think it's very interesting what started to be called an environmental footprint, and then ecological footprint, and now we're talking about our carbon footprint, which they are both related. So climate adaptive and nature-based solutions with increased ecology and biodiversity is really how we should be moving forward. It's not good enough to be basically saying 10% kawasan lapang. That's why we are seeing that most people, some municipalities have increased that to be 10% greenery, not just kawasan lapang, to increase the amount of green lungs within our city centers. So sustainably sourced timber is another element that I really am passionate to talk about, because when we were building the pavilion, sourcing for PEFC sustainable timber and getting the chain of command was very, very important for us. Sustainable sourced timber is dubbed as the material of the 21st century, both because of its lower embodied energy, but also because it's 20 to 60% lesser carbon compared to reinforced concrete. And it's able to sequester carbon of 1.64 kgs. Of course, carbon sequestration is really, really, I would say, abstract for the normal person on the street. And then the other aspect was demountable depending on scale. And this idea of demountable became our inspiration for the Malaysian pavilion. So World Expos have been happening since 1930s earlier. The British will say they started with it. The New Yorkers will say they were the first to do the World's Fair, but Expo actually resides in terms of officiating in Paris. At Dubai Expo 2021 and 2022, these were all the timber. There were more. I haven't added all of them. But apart from the Malaysian pavilion, these were the other timber pavilions that were basically built at Expo itself. The inspiration for the pavilion comes back from another project much earlier. We have a tradition of building in timber. We ourselves have a 100-year-old house that was moved from Kampong, I think in Perak, to our residence, and it has no nails. It is completely assembled without any nails as it was built. It's 100 years old because, as you know, when you build a kampong house, some of them actually put an element right at the top, what we call tiang besar. And on this tiang besar, there was a 100-year-old coin on it when we disassembled the house. But there is also another tradition, probably we see this less now, where we actually get to move some houses from one location to the other. And that's because the building is obviously is a family building, but the village would actually help in terms of moving a house. We call that usung rumah. I call it export, that we are basically being able to move it from one place to the other. So this became our inspiration in terms that we have this tradition and why aren't we thinking about it? So when we did the 2015 Malaysian Pavilion, which we were fortunate to sort of win as a competition, those were some of the ideas. The future now, as we stand, is on biomaterials and hybrid materials. We're moving very, very, I wish we were moving as fast as Elon Musk in his attempt to the Mars, but I don't know if any one of you have watched Elon Musk's documentary. It's taken him 18 years to get his spacecraft up basically to orbit. And I guess we don't have 18 years. It's taken 360 billion worldwide is been spent in terms of space exploration for 60 astronauts. That's almost unheard of. I wish we were using the same amount of money in terms of growing trees and greening our deserts and spending more in terms of research to do that in order to mitigate climate change. But the future is biomaterials and hybrid materials. When we did Milan Expo, our concept was the seeds because Malaysia grows rice and the seeds are basically seeds from the rainforest. Seeds become a metaphor for growth and also a metaphor for what's important to us. So this structure is actually done in glulam. This was part of our concept when we presented it in terms of having water bodies, harvesting water, a double skin, getting some photovoltaics. And this is our sun analysis and structural analysis that was happening for the building itself. So the timber all came from Malaysia. There was glulam and it was assembled on site. The idea is to prefabricate everything and then construct on site, and then we can defabricate and basically take all of it, the parts, and bring it home. Unfortunately, in this building, it was not brought home only because it was more expensive to bring it home than to keep it there, because our cost of construction in Malaysia is much lower than most of the Europeans. So it was not cost effective to bring it back, but these were some of the analysis looking at the floor plates being in concrete, floor plates being in timber, and the structure envelope also in timber. And so these were some of the analysis that were done for that and some of the inspiration. And we were also looking to see how we could use rice husk, how we could use bamboo in the materials of that. So we only use 800 pieces. We only use 800 pieces of concrete plate joints as the base of the structure. For the foundation, we use 3,000 steel bolts to connect the glulam, and we brought over about 200 metric tons of timber glulam from Malaysia to Expo to be built, basically. And they consist of this kind of timber that glulam that you see. But lowering our carbon became our sole objective when we built the Malaysian pavilion at Expo. And the idea here is not just Malaysia Boleh, but it's also to become an inspiration for Malaysia, but that Malaysia can build something that is a net zero carbon, and later on became a net zero energy as well, because Dewa, which is the TNB of Dubai, provided all the energy from solar to Expo in order to make it more sustainable. And that was announced only on the first day that we opened. Prior to that, we were already looking at 20% reduction in terms of energy use, and then solar already on top of the roof. So we had already been doing all those things. So the Malaysian pavilion is called Touching the Ground Lightly. As you can see, it's a building that's lifted off the ground. It's inspired, and you'll see the inspiration for the concept of it. It is completely cladded by timber. And it is, all the floors are completely in timber, marine ply, and on the roof as well. And then we use steel basically to bring up the structure with some structural beams going across to support the floors. So it touches the ground lightly was a metaphor for both in terms of the material, in terms of net zero, but in terms of our sort of tradition of building on stilts. So traditionally, Expo buildings representing Malaysia were always the sort of Minangkabau roof or structures like this. We wanted to show that Malaysia is very contemporary, and the interpretation here is that we're still building on stilts and lifting off the ground and lowering our footprint. So that was our target for this building. So this was achieved through synergy with nature, building with timber. Balancing energy systems, we had solar PV on top. We talk inside the pavilion about our reforestation and restoration, which is very, very important to Malaysia. As you know, Malaysia has more than 52% of forests that is to be maintained, over the 50%, which was a promise made on our rainforest. Balancing sustainable plantation was also a topic, because I don't know if you know, but 3 years ago, it was a very hard attack by America and Europe that Malaysia's palm oil is not sustainable. Actually, Malaysia's palm oil has a very strict certification of sustainability running now, has been running for the past couple of years. So they have replanting incentives also to ensure the effect of biodiversity and ecosystem of the forest. But I think it's all about world competition in terms of grains and oils. So we have essentially the corn oils that are from the more temperate climates, and we have the palm oil that is from the tropical climates. But Malaysia has a commitment in terms of balancing sustainable plantation, and this was one of the stories that we actually have inside the pavilion. So as you know, we have this tradition of building on stilts, something that is lightweight and made of natural materials that can breathe a bit. But in building in Dubai, we don't have to think about making the building breathe. We are concerned about the thermal temperatures that change. Thermal temperatures raise up to in the summer up to about 42 degrees. So it's thermal bridging was one of the things we had to address because of any metal stud structures that was supporting the timber. we actually had to insulate and also heavily insulate on top of the roof. But the concept is in the canopy of trees and living amongst the trees and creating something that exhibition spaces or exciting spaces inside. This was ground zero when we first started. It was just sand when we started. And when we started, we were told in 2019 that we actually had to return to ground zero, that after we finish, everything must be dismantled and taken away. I'm happy to say that Malaysia is one of the pavilions that was chosen under the Legacy program and will be standing for the next 5 years, and Malaysia will be running programs at the Malaysia Pavilion at Expo for the next 5 years. So it has managed to do that. But in thinking on how we constructed, we thought about how we would decommission the building and return to ground zero, and that the materials that we will be decommissioning from the building, 60% of that will be recycled or reused. So that included the steel and the timber. So that was part of right from the beginning, from the planning of the building. That's the pavilion itself, and you can see that we, in terms of the story and the concept, I don't know if any of you have managed to go to the Malaysian Pavilion. There is a meandering path to take people up. Part of that is that you have to allow a lot of queue, and in fact, we had a lot of people on what I call the sort of meandering path going up. The meandering path is basically inspired by our rivers, our big rivers that basically turn quite a lot. We wanted a building that was canopy structures, but more organic. And so rather than building, and I'll talk about timber structures moving forward in terms of tall buildings, it's not just about straight buildings, but we can actually create much more exciting. This is an elevation of the building. And this is Malaysia addressing the planet in crisis with a net zero pavilion. These were some of the sustainable elements that we had. We had big ass fans that were on the ground, something that you see in the resort up in Perak, Ipoh. It actually does work. People do stand underneath it and get cool because there's wind flow in these big ass fans. And the green that we did right in front, and a water pool, it was to cool down the area in front where people are coming in. And then, of course, we have high reflective roofs, solar PV, and underneath the spaces, we've also put some spaces inside there. See, these were some of the building structural studies that we had to do, considering the timber combined with hybrid steel in the construction. Where you see the hot spots are where, you know, the structural columns needs to be to support, and where the blues are where deflections are, where we actually have to prop up in those locations. And we created these things called chopstick structures. We didn't want just straight columns coming up. We wanted it really to look like it's, you know, branching up. So we had chopstick columns to hold the very heavy structures. This is showing the sort of deflection studies. And so in the end of the day, we had 660 meter cubes of concrete used because we had a basement. We have 4 levels. We were the smallest pavilion, one of the smallest pavilion lots at Expo. And I'm very happy to say that for the first time, Malaysia has won the gold medal for theme interpretation at Expo, at the World Expo. So this won on the last night of Expo itself. We have 181 tons of structural steel because this went up 4 stories. We had 7,225 meter cube, so feet cube of Meranti wood was used. This is a typical detail showing you the amount of insulation we have, something that we probably won't have as much in Malaysia because of our tropical environment. We do have to have insulation, obviously, to bring down the OTTB, but it probably, if we were building in Malaysia, wouldn't be as thick as you see here. And these were the wooden fins that were on the building facade. This is the building itself. And what did we were able to achieve? In terms of embodied carbon, we achieve a lightweight structure, sustainable timber facade, and timber flooring for low embodied carbon materials. Steel structure to be recycled. The base concrete is with fly ash. 75 here, I think actually that's a little bit lower now. It's about 60 material to deployed on decommissioning. So 5 years from now, when they decommission, they should be doing that. And then the land will be returned to ground zero. In terms of operational, we have as PVs about 10% reduction on the roofs, energy efficiency about 25.7, potable water about 85%, and DEWA basically remaining gave on operational energy from DEWA to support the whole expo. So these were some of the numbers, but I really wanted to talk about carbon sequestration. And that's in that when we calculated it before the DEWA and because of the embodied materials that we still use, we do still have to do carbon sequestration, and we had to calculate. So very interesting for Malaysia is that the guidelines at the world level was still using temperate plants, and FRIM with MGTC worked out in terms of what was the actual for Meranti in terms of reduction in terms of the carbon sequestration. So 20 hectares, there was the type of species, I can't pronounce this. This is going to be impossible for me. This basically gives you a carbon reduction of 20 tons of CO2. So Malaysia essentially had to look at some recovery. So with recovery, we actually basically have reduced that. So Malaysia still acquired about 4,000 tons of equivalent credits in sustainable forest management practices for the structure itself. So you imagine this is a very tiny structure, less than 2,000 square feet, and yet the amount of sequestration is that high. Can you imagine if you were building a shopping center? So building for transients was the aim for this pavilion. And whilst we are thinking about going to space, I'm glad that Malaysia is probably looking more at tree replanting and building up our natural environment, which is so important to us. This is one of the schemes on Relief that are doing 3 million tree planting, as I know that there are quite a lot of others. So what is emerging now? Emerging now, why I called it Growing Our Cities is that the movement amongst the timber pavilion structures and between Malaysia and Sweden, there was a conference held just at the end of Expo called Growing Our Cities. And we're basically developing this movement where the importance is to replenish and build our cities from, as you call it, renewable materials, which timber is. So there are a couple of examples, and most of these are CLT. They are not glulam. A few of them have a combination, but most of them are CLT, which is what northern temperate climates are developing. In Malaysia, we don't have a very strong CLT. I may be corrected on that, but my experience has only been with glulam. So in cities coming around, now we're seeing 18 stories. This is one that's already built in timber. The Telwood House, also 18 stories. The Hort building is 21 stories. It's a hybrid. As you can see, there's probably a lot more glass than these timber ones. And there is a development being done with Cambridge University called the River Beach Tower, with Perkins and Wills going up to 80 stories of hybrid. I think there's very interesting articles about where we need to go if we want to start building, but definitely the way to go for the what I call the medium rise is for Malaysia to go into building our own towers in timber. For that, we need to actually brace in terms of the fire requirements and walk through with regards to how we do that. The other element, of course, is unlike temperate climates, timber in the tropical environment wears a little bit more in terms of humidity and the climate that we have. So I picked this out from MTC in talking about sustainable timber, and I'm really glad to see that this is being pushed forward. I hope that more and more manufacturers are looking in terms of chain of custody to make their timber furnitures, doors, etc. from PEFC or sustainable timber resources, and have that chain of certification, which is really important because we found it quite difficult to track the chain of certification, which is very much proof that we are actually using sustainable timber. This I picked up from the Malaysian Timber Certification Council, which also is very interesting to me. We have 5.42 million hectares of PFC MTC's certified forests as of the 31st of March. So I think the more that we have, the lower the price will go. It's a bit like solar PV. When we started with solar PV, the price was not at the price that is on par now. Now the price of electricity from PV is equivalent to electricity that is created by coal that we know it as. So it may have taken about 10 years, but if I'm presuming that PFC MTCs will also come down in its price the more we use it. So the more we can get that transformation to sustainable timber, the better for us. So how are we going to move forward to create this advancing low carbon and net zero? The target now, right as where we stand, is targeting super low energy at about 50% reduction in our buildings and look at more resource efficiencies. By 2025, we should be advancing beyond 50% reduction, because 50% reduction, most buildings can do that now with only 1 or 2, maximum 3% cost increment just to get to a low energy. Growing more trees and creating a lower residentials with high density, as I've shown to you in affordable housing, may be the way to go. And we need to be net zero ready to be future-proofing by 2030. I call it the climate pandemic. If we thought that the pandemic from what we've been going through the past 2 years was bad, the climate pandemic will be even worse. So we need to flatten that curve and touch the ground lightly. Thank you very much. I am done.
Thank you, Architect Serina, for that very insightful presentation. So now we will proceed with the Q&A session. Just a reminder, please send in your questions via the Q&A box, and we will later get through as many questions as possible. So let's check the Q&A box. So we have here from Amar. Hello, dear Architect Serina. Can you please tell us the strategies that you usually use in the building to achieve net zero building? How did you reduce the energy up to zero?
Well, as you see, there's a combination of things you have to do. First is to try and put as much passive design. Obviously, in a location like Dubai, heat is a problem, so you don't have that in the tropics. You can naturally ventilate. So the first is to do passive design. The next is the choice of materials and construction that you use. So you want to lower your embodied carbon. The third is to be energy efficient in terms of your mechanical systems, your lighting, all the services that you have inside the building. The fourth is to provide renewable energy if you can. And then the fifth, because we really can't get down to a zero, is that you do have to basically plant more trees. So there's no two ways around it. Getting down to a net zero means that you have to totally naturally ventilate your building in the tropics and self-shade and just use fans instead of air conditioning to get your energy down as low as possible.
Okay, next question from Jonas in the chat box. If building a net zero building in Malaysia, what type of timber would you suggest to be used, since Meranti in the Malaysian climate is not durable?
Oh no, is Meranti not durable? Meranti is a hardwood. So Meranti is durable. It's whether you're going to use rubber wood. You know, I know you use rubber wood in furniture design, but it's not that hard and hard enough, structurally hard enough. So you need to go to some of the hardwoods or semi-hardwoods. MTC will probably be better to let you know what kind of wood range and what in the PEFC sustainable timber that you've been growing. But I have noticed in some of the research that I've been doing that there is some new plantations coming for fast growth plants that have a medium strength, and you can basically use medium strength timber. But you really, at this stage, I believe the towers that we're seeing at 18 stories, 30 stories is still using a hybrid. It's just that they are reducing the amount of material reliance on steel and concrete. So it's like, if I said today that we are building inside normal buildings, you do the fit out, you might have just the timber doors, and you might have timber flooring if it's a residential. So you might just have 10% of the materials for the building actually from timber, and 90% is concrete, steel, and others. In the way that they're trying to build now, and they're researching to build those buildings, you know, the one at 80 stories I find incredible, I must say. I'm quite sure there is a combination with hybrid steel, but basically is to get that balance and number lower. Yeah.
Okay. Next question from Arya. Is Malaysian Pavilion the only net zero carbon pavilion at Dubai Expo?
Yes.
How about other countries?
No, Malaysia was the only pavilion that was net zero.
How long does it take to complete the Malaysian Pavilion? And you said just now the structure will be there for 5 years, but what will happen after that?
Well, after 5 years, Expo itself, or the site is being changed into a residential neighborhood. It's been changed into a township. So the sustainable planning of Expo site by Dubai is that it's transforming that site into a township. So the pavilion will stand for 5 years, and after 5 years, they will decommission and take it down. But they still have to maintain the 60% in terms of recycling and upcycling the materials. So the steel, for example, can totally be recycled. The timber, if it can be used, reused. If not, it'll be recycled in terms of taking the material and using it as in hybrid materials.
Okay, next from Kao Curly. Good morning. Thank you, architect, for sharing your expertise. Very clear for promoting advancing net carbon and low carbon consideration. I'm just wondering how we can ensure building and resources are sustainably maintained. As we know, sustainable building maintenance is very difficult. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to ask.
You know, so I'm one of the co-founders of Green Building Index, which was started more than 12 years ago. When we did it, we were the first to put in that every 3 years, the building needs to be inspected to meet all the criteria again. We call it the renewal certification. That means the certification for green is only lasting for 3 years. We were the first in the world to introduce renewal. After that, LEED introduced renewal as well. Because we knew in our culture in Malaysia and in Asia, I would say, maintenance is not the highest of the elements. So we actually introduced that if you want to renew your certification for green, then you have to do a renewal process. That means we go back in to inspect the building.
From Jamila Marcin, what's your opinion in using timber in a medium cost development, mass development, such as shop lots and residential houses?
Shop lots and residential, sorry?
What's your opinion in using timber in a medium cost development or mass development, such as shop lots?
Well, I think when we're looking at medium cost developments, and if we're talking about residential and low residentials, for example, I'm not sure about shop lots, but I think that if we start to think about modular components, you know, just the way we did the glue lamp, a lot of the companies that are building the 6 stories that we saw at Growing Cities conference just at the end of Expo from Sweden and other northern countries, is that they're basically prefabricating. So if you can get into prefabricating, then obviously you can lower down the costs.
Right, okay, from AB, have you ever had a hard time to convince people to use low carbon material?
I honestly will tell you that yes, not so much for the Malaysian Pavilion, because Malaysia Pavilion wanted to showcase the best from Malaysia or what we can do, and I believe that we tried to do that. But in general, you know, it's all about the cost, right? So we were talking yesterday, I don't know, what is your water bill at home, everybody? Mine is 6 ringgit.
Wow.
6 ringgit is very little. I guess basically our electricity and water is very low. But if you are living in England, can you still see me? Najwa,
yes.
You seem to be frozen. Okay. Yeah, you know, if you are building in Europe or Australia or America, the price of electricity and water is a lot higher. And people are looking to save the amount of water or electricity. So first of all, we need to increase the commodity price for us to become more conscious about reducing our water use, our electricity use, and know the value of the money. When we talk to developers about, so we haven't, to be honest with you, no one has moved into looking at embodied material. I think there's only going to be a new project, a small building that's coming up that's going to try and do a net zero. We've encouraged it for most of others. Most are still building traditionally, not thinking about different types of materials and how to bring that down. I think there's a bit more research and a bit more in terms of the industry providing these kind of materials and solutions so that it can become more adopted across the construction field, yeah, and development.
Okay, I don't know from whom is this. Okay, hi, Architect Serina. Is WPC, wood polymer composite, can be considered as zero carbon contributor?
Wood as a composite, it depends on the material that you're putting in. We also had this discussion about wood composites. I don't know the measure yet on the composites, or we haven't. So Malaysian Green Building Council, we have something called Green Pages, where we basically have a selection of all the materials available in the industry, those who have signed up with us, to show what green products they have. In wood composite, Seban is here, he might be able to answer that, but I think that it all goes back to first using low VOC additives into your material, so that's a definite must. 2 is how have you made your composites, and how much of it is timber and how much is it in the hybrid. But I think you need to take it to the green label people to actually know the specifics of it. I mean, I'll be very curious as well, but good question. Something we had been discussing, because obviously wood composites in the tropics probably can last longer. And I think you know that. We have a problem even if we use hardwoods for timber decks because of rotting. So vertically, when we have it on residentials, you know, when we see 100-year-old houses and we say they kind of last quite well, they don't last as well as what you would see in a temperate climate. So we need to do the research with regards to the longevity of timber in the tropical environment.
Okay, next question from Mr. Peter Fish. How can the timber industry engage more with architects and specifiers to incorporate more timber and sustainable materials in construction? As most professionals in the industry do not consider sustainability in construction, but only cost.
We have been trying at the Malaysian Green Building Council to basically show that the cost increments are not as much as you think. If I say it's only 1 to 3%, and for every $10, it's only $1, $2, I don't think it's a lot of cost. So I think the first thing is that we have 500 projects, and we have actually studied quite a lot of projects. I'm putting my other hat on, not just as the architect, but with the council and with Green Building Index to prove that going green isn't cost, because your payback is within 5 years, even on the 1 to 3. We had a real struggle before with solar PV. Now solar PV is becoming quite widespread. I think we're going to have the same thing with timber. We're going to have to build up the knowledge. And I believe there's going to be amongst architects a real pull and interest to look at timber. But whether clients will pull into it will obviously come down to two things: whether they want to meet a better ESG report, which is now also becoming a requirement for big companies, and looking at alternative ways. I believe the big companies are looking at the ESGs. They're looking at nature-based solutions. And they're talking those. When we were looking at the study for Penang South Islands, we were talking about all bridges to be in timber, you know, all looking at putting in other building materials, but we were talking about timber, sustainable timber, bamboo, in developing biomaterials that will be part of the bio-development of Penang South Island. So I think you're going to see some changes.
Okay, from Amma, how do we achieve optimum thermal comfort in climates like Dubai while naturally ventilated buildings?
I think shading works for them to a degree. I think that you will still have, I think responding in Dubai, for example, they get the cold periods where the temperature goes down to a very comfortable level of, I think about 26. I don't know if it goes a bit lower, probably a bit low. I've never lived there, but we did study the temperature differences. I think overhangs, shading, that's why the mashrabia is very, very popular. Not so much in the office buildings that you see. Perhaps if they built a daya bumi in Dubai, it probably would be far more energy efficient, although I've just shown you that glass buildings can also be as low as 47% reduction in thermal conductivity to the facade, but it does mean you're using, in those kind of climates, they're using triple glazing. So in office buildings, it's going to be difficult for you to do passive design, except for shading. In Dubai, for residentials, the overhangs that they have, the circulation spaces outside and then bringing the building inside are probably some of the moves I would probably do if I was going to build. That's why you see the mosque analogy is probably one of the best that you can do. Yeah. But you need to seal the building also because of sandstorms. We get rain, they get sandstorms. And when a sandstorm comes, it's incredible.
Okay, last question here. In your opinion, do you think Malaysia able to achieve net zero?
I think, to be honest, with the globally, not only Malaysia, pure net zero is going to be difficult. As you can see, a small pavilion like that still needs to do planting and sequestration of trees. So, and we're not talking about hotels, shopping centers, which actually are guzzlers of energy. So I think that we can advance. That's why I use the word advancing net zero. We today can start building buildings that are 50% energy and work towards about 70% is my gut feeling to get to the optimum level. And that is good enough.
Okay, no more questions.
No more questions.
The Q&A.
Okay,
so yeah, so
just one, I think somebody asking about MTC, bring CASA, and promote sustainable farming. I think I just showed you before. Yes, there are issues. We still have issues on timber in our country. We are faring far better than most. I think that's something that you should take away from this, that we are making efforts and we are above the 50% line. More can be done for sure. That's the same with everything.
Okay, we have come to the end of the webinar session today. And before I end it, Architect Serina, do you have any last word to the audience?
No, thank you very much. I think more than anything is that I want to inspire you to basically go on the path of sustainability and adopt far more sustainable practices. We have a finite earth and finite resources. So as I said, I would prefer that 360 billion. Whilst I am a science geek and I do like science and technology, if you've seen all the buildings that I've built, you will see that the technology in there from underfloor to the facade has all been very, very interesting. However, I think now's the time for us to spend that money on greening the earth. So that's my last word.
Thank you, Architect Serina. And on behalf of Malaysia Timber Council, we would like to thank Serina for taking her time being the speaker for this webinar. And for information, there will be a live feedback poll and survey later. So we will appreciate if you could spend your time to answer the survey to improve our future events. And I hope that you find this session insightful. And thank you everyone once again for joining us today. We really appreciate your participation and hope to see you again in our next MTC Timber Talk series, which tentatively will be in July. For information, this recording for this webinar session will also be shared in Malaysia Timber Council YouTube channel. So please check them out later. And also, I would like to take this opportunity to wish our Muslim attendees happy Ramadan. May this holy month give you good health, bring joy and peace to your life. Take care and stay safe. May you have a wonderful day and have a great weekend ahead. Okay, bye.
Thank you very much for attending this talk.